One of the greatest moments in Irish sporting history occurred in 1990 when Ireland qualified for the Soccer World Cup, the Football World Cup, for the first time in its history. Ireland made its way, narrowly, out of the group stages, and then in the next round faced Romania, and defeated Romania after a dramatic penalty shootout, when David O'Leary got up and scored the decisive penalty that brought Ireland into the quarter-finals of the World Cup to play a game against Italy. And commentating on the game back home on Irish television, the Irish commentator and controversial pundit Eamon Dunphy jumped out of his seat on national television and declared that Robert Emmet's epitaph could now be written because Ireland had taken her place among the nations of the earth. It wasn't the first time Emmet's name was associated in a sporting context. Glasgow Celtic is a soccer team in Scotland that is supported by many of the Irish who emigrated there and many Irish in Ireland. Its large stadium, Celtic Park, was opened in 1889 by Michael Davitt. And as he pushed the trowel into the ground to consecrate this as the great football stadium, there were two boys there dressed as Robert Emmet. In 2002, Ireland was back at another World Cup, and this time there was a furious controversy as the star Irish player, the captain, Roy Keane, either went home or was sent home in disgrace. And he delivered an outburst, a speech attacking the Irish manager, Mick McCarthy. And Niall Quinn, who was on the opposite side to Roy Keane in that, later wrote about how this speech was so eloquent, was so powerful, that it could go right up there with Robert Emmet's speech from the dock. And Emmet's speech, and especially those final lines about Ireland taking her place among the nations of the earth, created an obligation on future generations to decide about what kind of Ireland had been achieved or would be achieved and what people should strive for. And it's an interesting way of starting this reflection about the nature of commemoration. The commemoration of the historical events of the period 1798 to 1916 and beyond that has always been controversial. In 1998, Ireland celebrated the bicentenary of the 1798 rebellion, and there were a series of events all around Ireland. You had various groups of pikemen who dressed up in some as in military uniforms, some as just peasants, carrying pikes, marching around the country. Politicians got involved. And what they were able to proclaim in 1998, the year of the Good Friday Agreement, was that this was a great moment, which showed that Ireland had joined together, Protestant, Catholic and dissenter in 1798, and that here, in present-day times, Ireland had put aside the sectarianism of the past. Now, some historians were uncomfortable with that because they said, well, this is ignoring the sectarian atrocities of the 1798 rebellion. This is ignoring Scullabogue, Wexford Bridge. Scullabogue, when those prisoners were marched, herded into a barn, and then the barn was set alight. And some critics of this commemoration said that we had sacrificed a complex historical narrative for the sake of making everyone feel good about the kind of Ireland we lived in now. I don't think all of those criticisms were fair, but I do think that commemoration can be politically loaded. It can reflect very much the values of the present day. Some of the things that happened in 1998 were quite bizarre. The Tour de France, that great racing tournament, which even then was beset by allegations of drug use and such. Well, the Tour de France began in Ireland in 1998. And that was to commemorate, to honour the contribution of the French to the United Irish effort in 1798. Although I suppose in some ways it was appropriate, because back in 1798 when Humbert and his troops landed at Killala Bay and made their way to Balnamuck, they only fought for a little bit before surrendering and heading home. In other words, they got on their bikes and left. And that was exactly what happened in 1998. So some people thought that, well, maybe that wasn't a good thing. In 1998, you also had some of the groups of pikemen falling out amongst themselves. There was a split amongst the pikemen because some believed the pikemen should march in military formation, holding their weapons like this. But others believed that these peasants would have had no training and therefore they shouldn't be marching, they should be walking as ordinary men. And there was a vicious fight. And even 5 years later, when the bicentenary of the death of Robert Emmet was being commemorated, the marching pikemen who were asked to go in the Dublin St. Patrick's Day parade refused to march alongside each other because the wound had not been healed. And some divisions are just too great. Those debates over commemoration existed in the 19th century as well, as people tried to come to terms with what had happened in 1798 and again with Emmet in 1803. It's interesting that you still find people trying to make a case for being able to find the head and body of Emmet. And that seems to have haunted people, especially the great Romantic poets in the early 19th century. Emmet inspired them greatly. Percy Bysshe Shelley visited Ireland in 1812 and handed out pamphlets calling for Ireland to be free, but also celebrating the life of Robert Emmet. He interviewed those who had known Emmet. He became obsessed by the Irish story. The story also inspired Robert Southey, the future poet laureate, who was inspired to write a poem about Emmet. But this was in contrast to his immediate reaction when he heard about the rebellion, when he rejoiced in the way that it had been crushed. He said, "Do paddies always make some noble blunder, happily for all quiet people who have an objection to being murdered?" Thomas Moore, Emmet's childhood friend who would accompany him to Trinity, he wrote a number of poems on the death of Emmet, including "O breathe not his name." "O breathe not his name, let it sleep in the shade, where cold and unhonoured his relics are laid. Sad, silent and dark be the tears that we shed, as the night dew that falls on the grass over his head." And that idea about breathing not his name was the idea of we should honour Emmet's words. We should honour his last request, and we shouldn't be rushing to a judgment about him because he had left us this lasting legacy. And Moore would do much to popularise Emmet in the United States in the 19th century. He also did much to create a mythology about Sarah Curran, the woman who had supposedly died of a broken heart afterwards, although none of that was true, or at least not directly. She died shortly after the birth of her son. And his verse, "She is far from the land," contributed to that mythologising. Shelley wrote a poem on Robert Emmet's grave, playing on the fact that we didn't know where his head and body were to be found. He wrote, "No trump tells thy virtues, the grave where they rest. With thy dust shall remain unpolluted by fame, till thy foes by the world and by fortune caressed shall pass like a mist from the light of thy name." Washington Irving, who wrote the great short story about the legends of Sleepy Hollow, he also wrote a story about Sarah Curran, which was included in that very same collection as the great story of the legends of Sleepy Hollow. And in it, he spoke about he wrote of how Sarah Curran, after the death of Emmet, was brokenhearted, how she would wander around various events, would attend balls like a ghost, ethereal, and how she would start playing the violin or the harp. And when all the guests in the ball would hear her playing this haunting music, they would all spontaneously break down crying. It was like something out of Twin Peaks. It was like something out of some modern day a Gothic story. But that was the legends of Sarah Curran, this haunted woman broken by the death of the man she loved. Whereas, of course, as we've seen, the story of Sarah Curran was far more complex and, in fact, far more tragic than that. We see the legacy of Robert Emmet continuing forward into the 20th century. When Michael Collins, as Minister for Finance, wanted to raise war bonds, they shot a film. And that film would be shown in cinemas before the main attraction, before the main movie, in Ireland and especially in the United States. And so they found a table where Michael Collins could sign all these war bonds. And the caption on the screen revealed that this was the table where Robert Emmet had been beheaded. This was the block where the martyr had his head sliced off. And thus Michael Collins was able to show a lineage back to Robert Emmet, back to that patriot. We have seen how it influenced Patrick Pearse, who wanted a rebellion in Dublin to erase the guilt of the Dublin people not rising with Emmet in 1803. That the legacy of Robert Emmet proved powerful. It evoked strong feelings in all of these people. And as we'll see, it also had a legacy beyond these shores. Whereas in the United States, clubs sprung up to honour the life and legacy of Robert Emmet. His speech from the dock was performed on the New York stage in 1806, just 3 years after Robert Emmet's execution. And as we'll see, it also influenced the daughter of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy.